It is now my tremendous pleasure to introduce Jamil Dakwar. Jamil Dakwar is a director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Human Rights Program, which is dedicated to holding the U.S. government accountable to its international human rights obligations and commitments. He leads a team of lawyers and advocates who use a human rights framework to complement existing ACLU legal and legislative advocacy, primarily in the areas of counterterrorism, racial justice, immigrants' rights, women's rights, and criminal and juvenile justice. Jamil also serves as the ACLU main representative to the United Nations and has testified before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, United Nations human rights bodies, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe about human rights violations in the United States. We would also like to acknowledge and thank Jamil for his tremendous leadership in the human rights community here in the United States. During all human rights reviews of the U.S., he has played a key role in coordinating civil society participation through the U.S. Human Rights Network. Specifically, he was a co-chair of the U.S. Human Rights Network's ICCPR task force in the lead up to and during the Human Rights Committee's review of the U.S. in 2014. He also chaired the National Security Working Group for the UPR process and coordinated the ACLU's participation in all 4 review processes. As such, Jamil has played a very, very strong leadership role in ensuring that the voices of civil society are represented. So we'd like to thank you, Jamil, for your leadership and to invite you to the podium.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'm really very honored to be here today. We don't get this opportunity to speak to Congress and as part of a briefing, to you as staff working very hard on some of these issues. So we're really thrilled as human rights advocates, especially the ones of us that are outside DC, outside the Beltway, just to get to engage with you and talk to you about some of these issues. And as someone who have been leading the ACLU international human rights work, I see this an important part of my work is to engage and to continue to be in touch with my colleagues in the Washington Legislative Office here and with other colleagues that work in DC because there's a really central role for members of Congress, for Congress, in addition to obviously to the executive branch and other branches, whether the courts and obviously when it comes to issues of state and local governments to implement and make sure that the United States is adhering to its international human rights obligations. So what I'm trying to do in the very few minutes that I have is just to set the stage of what we are going to talk to you about today and to really give you a sense of what went on in the past year. The past year was really an exceptional year for the United States human rights reviews because it was the first year that all these 4 reviews have come together in less than 18 months or even 14 months time frame. So we've got, usually these kinds of reviews happen every 4, 5, or 6 years. And depending on when the government submits these reports to the United Nations, you get to these reviews that happen very far away in Switzerland, Geneva. And really you don't really get to hear much about this in the United States because it's usually the reporters or in Geneva that write about them. Few reporters maybe here that get interested. But only when you have really big issues that are really at the top agenda, the national agenda of the United States, that then you get much more interest. But in the last couple of years, we've seen a change. We've seen a change in the sense of how these issues are so interrelated, meaning United States issues are not only domestic issues. These are issues that are really of interest to the international community, certainly to the international human rights community. And certainly when you're talking about immigrants' rights and migrants' rights, these are issues that are certainly of interest to people who are outside the US as much as it's important and interest to people in the United States. So from that perspective, when it comes to the United States human rights reviews or human rights record in general, there's always an interest at the world stage to see what the United States is doing in a particular issue, particular challenges, particular problems that are arising. Not as much as just the bashing of the United States because it is a world superpower, but it's really about whether the United States is setting a good example, whether the United States is following its own commitments, the beginning of the founding of the United Nations. So one of the reviews that we had, the most recent one, and I would just touch on them very quickly and then just go and tell you one example that I thought it would be very, very interesting to share with you. One of the reviews that happened just a month ago on May 11th in Geneva was called the Universal Periodic Review. You have in the packet materials, or I think one of the materials that were circulated, summaries of these different treaties. I'm not going to go over these complicated acronyms and names because they're really so, but just to give you really a gist of the summary of it. The Universal Periodic Review is a review that is a peer government-to-government review that happens every 4.5 years by the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is the highest human rights body within the United Nations system. Every member of the United Nations has to go through this review, whether you are a member of the Human Rights Council or not, whether you like it or not. And the reason for that is that this is a matter of the fundamentals of the United Nations and the founding document of the United Nations, the United Nations Charter, which this body, the US Senate, particularly the US Senate, has provided consent and advice back in the days in the 1945 when the United Nations was created. And there it started the universal system where human rights has become a central piece in it. Going through 1948 with the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and subsequent treaties that were adopted by the international community, by the United Nations particularly, but negotiated by governments. These are not treaties that are just imposed by the United Nations, as sometimes you hear here in the United States in particular, that the United States is meddling in the United States affairs. That's not really the case. It is a matter of all governments from all around the world, from different regions, coming together to discuss really issues that have evolved, particularly after World War II and after the horrors of the Holocaust in World War II. How can we make sure that human dignity is protected? How can we make sure that principles of humanity are the fundamental agreements and fundamental relationships and affairs between different governments? And most importantly, the protection of human rights is no longer left to the governments themselves, because otherwise you would have authoritarian governments doing very bad things, horrors that cannot be stopped. And so there need to be an early warning system, there need to be constant monitoring, there need to be a system of accountability at the international level. So since the 50s and after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the United Nations, with all members, and with the new members joining, through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, negotiated a number of human rights treaties. Some of those treaties, the United States have become even a leader and strong advocate and strong supporter, like, for example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was ratified by the United States in 1992, which was the first major human rights treaty to be ratified. This is the treaty that the United States went through a review in March of last year before the UN Human Rights Committee. So when you hear the ICCPR, it relates to civil and political rights. And it not only relates to the civil and political rights of persons and citizens in the United States, it actually relates to the civil and political rights of all people who are subject to US jurisdiction, of all people who are subject to US behavior and conduct. And one fundamental principle that's really coming out of the system is, regardless of your immigration status, your rights need to be protected. And therefore, when you're talking about civil and political rights, putting aside the issue of voting, which is the only exception to the issue of rights of non-citizens who are not, it could be migrant, could be undocumented, could be green card holders, etc. But the only exception to the civil political rights protections is the right to vote. So aside from that, all other rights should be provided at the equal footing to all people who are under jurisdiction of that party, as part of the government that is obligated to protect their rights. So the Human Rights Committee, and you hear from our colleagues here, that will talk about some of the recommendations that were made by this Human Rights Committee. It's a body of independent experts that reviews regularly how the governments are implementing their international human rights obligations. They are usually through reports that are submitted by the government. The State Department, the US State Department, takes the lead on coordinating the drafting of the report, but it's a really interagency process that involves different agencies from DOJ, DHS, and others, as well as sometimes state and local governments. We think that that piece is still weak. We still want to see more state and local government involvement in these processes, because this is where most of these rights and protections are really come to play. when it comes to human rights at the state and local government. But nevertheless, these reports come before the United Nations human rights bodies and the first three that we will be discussing, the Human Rights Committee under the ICCPR, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which reviews compliance with another major treaty that the United States ratified in 1994, which is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which is the major anti-discrimination, anti-racism treaty in the world. And the third major one is the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, which the United States also ratified in 1994. Now, all of the three treaties, they have a special body, as I said, of independent experts coming from the different countries that ratify these treaties, and they are not representing their own countries. Maybe one or two of them out of maybe 100, they will sound some critique that is more political than expert-based or rights-based. But for the most part, and I think this is really our assessment, that's why U.S. civil society organizations, coordinated by the U.S. Human Rights Network, invested a lot of time and resources in engaging in this process, because we see that the United States is part of the human rights system. It calls on other countries to adhere to their own international human rights obligations, so the time comes that the United States has to also account for its own human rights obligations. And so when we appear before these committees, there's a process where the committee starts to ask questions. Some of their questions are informed by civil society input, reports that are submitted before these committees called shadow reports. And then at the end of this process, usually it's a 2-day session, they issue what we call concluding observations. Again, it's just like a UN, Geneva acronym or language that you don't have to remember. But what's important really about it is that these are not necessarily legally binding recommendations, but they are, as they're called, recommendations are really inform and try to send the United States a message that here's the areas where we think you can do better. Here's the area based on our expertise. Based on what we hear from other countries, there are some best practices that you can actually implement in your country. Sometimes they even hear about legislation. Pieces of legislation are being negotiated, debated here in Congress. And they do urge the United States to comply with international human rights obligations by passing legislation. In fact, this is actually one of the areas where the United States can do better in terms of engaging Congress as to how to fully comply with international human rights obligations. And this is one of the things that we would like to discuss. So the first three reviews that happened in March of 2014, August of 2014, and November 2014 were all by three bodies that are expert-based bodies. The last review that happened last month is a different process. It's a little bit more political process because it involves governments questioning the United States about its own human rights record, not necessarily experts. Of course, these are diplomats that represent their governments. Some of them have human rights experience, but they do reflect the foreign policy of their own governments. So when you read those recommendations, keep that in mind. That doesn't mean that these recommendations should not be taken seriously. In fact, many of the 348 recommendations that came out last month are very good in terms of addressing the real problems, and certainly in the area of immigration and immigrants' rights and migrants' rights. One area that I want to highlight before I close is the area of family detention. This is one of the areas where the U.S. is really an outlier, where the U.S. is a country, certainly in the democratic world or the developed world, where the United States is the only country in the world that detains families. And this is an issue where it got a lot of questions and a lot of interest by the human rights bodies, but as well as the Human Rights Council members. Specifically, there was one recommendations that were made by Sweden. You have it in your materials, and I'd like to read it because it really reflects what we think is the concern and the problem, but also offers some solutions. And the Swedish recommendation, which is numbered 5257, says the following: halt the detention of immigrant families and children, seek alternatives to detention, and end use of detention for reason of deterrence. This is a spot-on recommendation that says to the U.S. government, we as Sweden, but joined perhaps by other governments that sounded similar concerns, We are asking you to reconsider your policy in this particular area because this policy is inconsistent with international human rights. And the truth is, it is not only a matter of the United States, whether we do it or not, nobody cares. It does matter because the United States sets a precedent, sets, in this case, a dangerous and bad precedent for other governments to follow. So the question whether we want the United States to be the one that sets bad precedent and dangerous precedents, whether it's the one that would put children and families in those kinds of conditions where there will be life scars for the rest of their lives, or we are really going to be embracing a human rights-based approach to these kinds of policies. So one of the things that I'm going to leave you with is that the United States has to respond by September to the Human Rights Council, to each and every one of those recommendations. What are the United States government response will be, whether they accept the recommendation, meaning that they will take a commitment, make a new commitment to implement the recommendation in full, or whether they will accept it in part, or they will reject any given recommendation. And this is here where it's important that this administration, particularly the Obama administration, hears from members of Congress, and we know that several members of Congress signed on letters, sent the right message to the administration that family detention, in this particular case, that example, and you will hear about other examples, is the right thing to do. You have the chance to tell the world, no, we can do this better. We can do it without resorting to detention. Alternative to detention works. These community-based alternative to detention work, and we know that it worked because we have experience doing that in the country. There are small experiences, but we have to expand them. And that way, the United States will proudly go back to the international community and say, we are doing it. We can continue to be the immigrant country of immigrants, a country that provides safe haven from persecutions. But at the same time, when people come here, we will not re-traumatize them again. We will treat them humanely, and we will do that as setting a good example to the world. Thank you very much.